How's it going, everyone? This is Kevin from Audio Digital, and today we're going to talk about the difference between FM and PM, or we're going to talk about the difference between phase modulation and frequency modulation. So the first thing I need to establish up front here, and this is something that I was confused with, and I've heard other people talk about this, and they're not getting this exactly right, and I was also getting it wrong until, I don't know, some years ago when I did a little research. But when you see the term FM, almost in every case, it's actually phase modulation. When you look at the DX7 or you're looking at FM8 or pretty much everywhere where you see the term FM, with a few exceptions, is actually talking about phase modulation. And true frequency modulation is significantly different. And so let's talk about what true frequency modulation would be and is, and then we'll circle back around to what phase modulation is. So basically, I have a frequency dial here, and if I play this and then I move it up and down, then I'm doing frequency modulation. I'm changing the frequency over time. So there you go. Case solved. We've got frequency modulation. Well, the issue here is that with frequency modulation, if I do it fast enough, right? If I go into audio rates, and then I can change the timbre of the sound. But the problem is that in the grid here, if I just connect this up here and I start to modulate it, I get some timbres that kind of remind me of FM. But the problem here is that it's all atonal and weird when I increase the gain, and that's how we get different timbres or timbre shifts in FM, is that we increase and decrease the modulator gain. But when I do that here, I'm not getting a consistent pitch, and I'm not really getting consistent, or maybe what I might call a linear timbre shift. It's somewhat, but it's kind of all over the map. And so if I were to do something like modulate this with an envelope and try to make some sort of a bell sound or something from this, I'm getting something kind of weird here. It's atonal. It's not what we would normally consider to be FM. So what's the problem here? What's going on? Well, there's a couple of things that would keep us from being able to do FM in most synthesizers. The first thing would be is that it's impossible to modulate something at audio rates. That's not the case here in the grid, but if I look at something like Massive here and I go, hey, let me just take this LFO and drop it here, and then I'm going to turn this up and modulate this. I can get up to this speed, which I'm not sure what that frequency is, but it's probably around 50, but that's as far as I can get, and I can't really get into anything past like 50 hertz. So most synthesizers just won't let you get into deep into audio rates to get that. So that would be the problem there. But in something like the polygrid here, we can modulate at audio rates. But there's another problem. And the problem there is that we're modulating pitch and not frequency. And so you're like, well, what's the difference? Pitch, frequency, isn't that the same thing? Yes and no. So with frequency is going to be kind of linear, going from 0 up to whatever. But if we are modulating pitch, it's going to be this kind of exponential curve. So if I went up an octave and down an octave modulating pitch, I'm actually going higher in frequency than I am going lower. So around a central frequency, I'm going to kind of disproportionately be pushing upward in frequency as opposed to downward. And that's going to shift the overall pitch of the sound upward if I'm doing that. So, and again, when we listen to what happens here, in the poly grid, when I increase there's a clear increase in pitch that's happening, and that shouldn't happen in a normal FM sound. So if I look at phase 4 here, and I'm modulating this oscillator with this one, we get a timbre shift without actually getting any pitch shift. And that's something that phase modulation or traditional FM is really great at, right? So what would we need to do if we wanted FM to act more like traditional FM or phase modulation? Well, we would need to modulate frequency instead of pitch. So that's rule number 1. You need to be able to modulate frequency instead of pitch. And most oscillators don't really allow you access to just a linear frequency, and not even the ones in the grid allow you to do that. You can go up and down 27 hertz, but that's it. You can't really do anything more than that. There is a synth within Bitwig that does allow you to offset with a frequency scale, and that's FM4 here. So here we can go up in frequency, and then we can go to 0, which is going to be the pitch of the note. So I'm not offsetting the frequency at all. And then I can also go negative into negative hertz. And what does that mean? Well, basically it means that, like, if I'm starting at 44 hertz, if I offset this negatively, it's going to reduce the frequency. And if I go all the way down to 0 and keep subtracting, I'm going to go into negative frequency, which, what's negative frequency? Well, it's simply that we are phase flipping the signal. So instead of, going up in pitch and then, instead of going up and down in the waveform, I'm going down and up. So I'm just phase flipping the frequency. And if I can do that, if I can go around a central frequency and then add and subtract equally above and below it, I'm going to get a coherent timbre shift. And one synthesizer that does let me do that is VPS Avenger. That, when they say FM, they actually truly are talking about true FM. And we can see that if we just do this. Yeah, where is it? Oh yeah, I'm gonna have to turn this thing off real quick. Need it. So here we go. So here we have timbre shift with no pitch shift. And we can actually see in this graph that we are increasing the frequency here, and then we're coming down in frequency and hitting 0 and then going into negative numbers. So notice on this side of the graph, the frequency is higher than on this side. That's because of the offset. When we go into negative numbers, we're not going to reach the same negative, that we're not going to reach as low of a frequency into negative numbers as we do a higher frequency because of the offset, if that makes sense. So doing it that way will give you something that sounds a lot like phase modulation, but it does have some character differences. And one of the things that you can easily hear is that if I use this oscillator and I put it down to a very low frequency and we listen to that, we get that kind of wobbly thing. With phase modulation, you're not going to get that. Let's look at, this is phase 4. If I make the frequency of the modulator really low and really go hard on it here, the actual variation in pitch is kind of slight, okay? And so that's going to be a pretty different sound than what you're going to get from true FM, true frequency modulation. Now with phase modulation, you can think of it like having a tape deck, right? So imagine you have a tape deck and you're playing a waveform on that tape. And then what you did was take the play head and you moved it back and forth in compliance with a modulator. So positive numbers mean that the head moved left, and negative numbers, or negative voltage on that oscillator meant the head moved to a certain position right or a certain position left. Does that make sense? So here's a diagram. So in this diagram, you can see that like this is the position, the modulator is the position of this playhead. So this line here is a playhead, and it's playing this piece of tape that is also playing. So when it's moving back and forth, the result is that the waveform is changing, is getting all these interesting complex harmonics, right? And so as I slow down the frequency of the modulator here, we can see that the resulting waveform isn't changing as much in pitch, because this isn't really linked to pitch. Pitch is an incidental thing that will change because I'm moving the playhead. Whereas in frequency modulation, the frequency, there's discrete frequencies associated with the voltage of the modulator. So in any case, you're going to get a different result. So if you can keep that in mind, if you can think about, okay, I'm moving the playhead with phase modulation or traditional FM, and I'm changing the speed of the tape with true FM, then you can kind of know what you're going to get when you use the different techniques. So anyway, going back to the polygrid here, there is no way that I can see to do true frequency modulation that's going to be useful. You can do this, but I mean, yeah, and that sounds interesting, but that's not the same thing as what a DX7 does. If you want to do the same thing that a DX7 does, you got to plug into the phase hole here. And then now we're getting something that sounds a lot more like a DX7. If I envelope it like this, so coherent pitch and predictable timbre shifts, exactly what we're looking for. Now, if I want something in the grid here to sound a lot more, even more like a DX7 or even more like phase 4, what I want to do is to be able to increase the amplitude of the signal going into this modulator, because even at full gain, it's not quite as sharp, and it doesn't have as many as much high frequency overtones as what you get out of pushing the amplitude in like a DX7 all the way up. So what we can do is simply get a gain and just slop it in here, and then we can get that full timbre range like we do and that's going to be closer to what we get like in phase 4 here when I put this back to normal. That's much closer to what we get here too. Let's turn that up. So this is basically how you're going to do FM in the grid. This is much closer to what happens in, FM8 or DX7 or so forth. So hopefully that was trackable. Let me know if this was confusing or not. And, give me any questions that you have about this. Please, if this was helpful and you liked it, like and subscribe to my channel. And I'm going to give more kind of in-depth synthesis techniques and understanding the architecture of synthesis, especially using the grid going forward. So Anyway, thanks for watching this. Enjoy creating music and have a wonderful day. Bye.